It's quite funny to think that while my childhood was actually kind of miserable, cold and depressing and lonely, and my sources of entertainment were limited, I was quite fortunate and lucky to get my hands on video games every now and then. Because if it wasn't that, it was either watching some Christian cartoon kid stuff that was, oh boy.
And courageously follow Jesus.
Or it was taking a long, warm shower for fun. You mix these two things as your only sources of entertainment as a kid, and you can imagine you probably hit depression quite a few times. Then again, I've always been a sad sack of shit my whole life, because it's always been so easy for me to get depressed. Maybe emotionally, I'm a lot weaker in person than I am on the internet, and maybe I compensate for that on the internet by being a complete asshole and get involved in so many day-long Twitter wars because I call people console peasants because video games, right. We're talking about video games. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that video games will prevent you from hanging yourself or blowing your brains out from depression, nor do I even recommend to people that video games be their only source to cope through these times, because there are better ways. Communicate with people, take medication, go see a psychiatrist. But that's not to say that video games can't serve as a slight or minor coping mechanism. Dimming out the lights in your room and sitting in front of a TV or a monitor for 18 hours a day isn't going to exactly help you. You gotta face your issues, you gotta go out there, you gotta socialize. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you that video games single-handedly got me out of depression. Gosh, now that I'm thinking about it, the way I'm wording this entire video is pretty depressing. No. Video games definitely helped me through these times. And I wish I could tell you a far more interesting story. I wish I could tell you that video games conquered my fears. I wish I could tell you that video games made me a better person. I wish I could tell you that video games helped solve every issue that made me a depressed person. But that's not the reality. Rather, they were the source of entertainment that I simply needed. They were the one thing that could make me smile, laugh, cry, or fall asleep to just listening. They helped provide more emotions than what I was currently feeling in these times, which was nothing but pale, cold, painful burdens. Some of these burdens range from a breakup down to the passing of a close friend. Playing video games are not the solution to countering these emotions. That's why I always say play responsibly. Just before the summer of 2009, I'd done some stuff that angered my mom. I guess you could say I was being a troublemaker, and it caught up to me. So of course the solution was that my mother was going to send me to California to stay with my dad for the majority of the summer till I came back and I guess shaped up or whatnot. This of course was more of a reward to me because at the time I had secretly snuck with me a Nintendo DS, one that my mom didn't know I even had. Sure, the games I had with it weren't that great, but don't you fucking insult fossil fighters, I will kill you. But just before I had taken off to California, a friend of mine had lent me a little RPG known as Contact. I guess what you could say made this trip so depressing was the fact that my dad lived in the middle of nowhere on Route 66 out in the Mojave Desert. He had no cable or internet, he was piss poor, and all he had was a black and white TV with a clothes hanger for an antenna. On top of that, if we wanted to get any food or groceries, we'd have to drive about 13 miles to get down to the city. If I could find a good word to describe all of this, I'd say it was isolation. No fapping material, no good music, no good shows to watch. Well, I mean, Sid the Science Kid wasn't all that bad. It was, pretty watchable. I wasn't in contact with many people. There wasn't a lot to do around my dad's place. It was just an empty, barren desert, and oftentimes I'd be left alone with my thoughts, which were kind of scary for me. But this little game, this, well, quite honestly, Earthbound ripoff, wasn't really that great of an RPG, to be honest. not the best combat mechanics, the dialogue is corny and cheesy, the story doesn't connect very well, characters are bland and boring. The concept is good, and it works for what it is. It played different than other RPGs, and I guess that's what I admired, but the one thing pushing me through these times was not even the characters or the gameplay or the environments or the graphics. What this game had was one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard. Words really can't describe the emotions the music made me feel, but I mean, just have a listen. It's strange, isn't it? How almost every part of a game can be completely mediocre or awful, and yet the music can somehow compensate for a lot of the game's shortcomings. There'd be moments where I'd just plug my headphones in, and I'd sit in the car while I waited for my dad at the gas station, and I would just listen. The music would somehow make the other aspects of the game much more memorable. In essence, it's ultimately one of those games that you know is incredibly flawed and not great at all, but you still love it. Its musical composition was powerful enough to help make me feel emotions I couldn't feel at the time, and that says a lot about a game. 2014 had to be the darkest and most depressing time of my life. I've discussed it in full detail before in this video, and just when you thought your life was miserable, well, I make you look like a scrub. The events that happened that year left me scarred for quite a while. Everything from one of my best friend's little brothers dying, who was practically a little brother to me, all the way to my ex dumping me and cheating on me for my brother, to losing all of my friends and the relationship I had with people at church. I was in a dark place. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I was probably the most unhealthy I'd ever been in my life in terms of a mental state. I didn't feel anything other than anger and sadness. And to be honest, I wasn't even playing a lot of video games either. But at this point in my life, I wasn't exactly a PC gamer, so I didn't know the magical power of emulation, and I regret it. Cause as you can see here, at the time I was what you may call a retro gaming enthusiast. I was looking to buy the old school gaming consoles and old school games. Not really playing them, because you know, they kinda ran like shit. But more so, I just liked the idea of collecting them. One day at a thrift shop, I was finally able to find what I was looking for. I was trying to get out of the house, trying to get my mind off things, and there it was, a copy of Phantasy Star 4, a title I didn't only want to collect but actually play. During this time, my mom and my two younger brothers took off to Tijuana for the majority of summer, so I was home alone, unemployed during this time. I had ties with people I once called friends severed. I no longer had a girlfriend, and earlier that year, a close friend of mine had passed away. So I found myself putting this little old game into my Sega Genesis and escaping from the dark, cruel world into that of another world which was also cruel. At a first glance, this game looks like your average JRPG, colorful, smiling faces, but there are a lot of moments in the game where the characters deal with loss. But there were also moments that made you smile and laugh and realize how well written the characters actually were. There may not have been a lot of JRPGs on this level on the Sega Genesis, but of the few that there were, this was easily one of the best 16-bit RPGs I had ever played. What I desired at the time was a journey, to be taken away somewhere else, to focus on the events of other people, Whether they were real or not, I was a part of that adventure. I suppose anything that could help distract me from my real world problems and situations I was currently in. When the struggles of your real life suck so much, you would much rather participate in someone else's struggle. And unlike movies or TV shows, that is something video games can do. And that is something Phantasy Star 4 did so well. Okay, come on. You all saw this coming. Who wouldn't be surprised with this title here? But Papa Fred, how exactly does such a gloomy, depressing environment cheer you up? Especially the one in Dark Souls? Well, I don't know. I guess it really stems down to being in an environment that's far more depressing than that of your own, where death is so common and the mood is so depressing, you forget just how depressing and sad yours is. But Dark Souls, unlike most games that use this type of atmosphere or storytelling, Dark Souls takes it to another level. Because while many areas of the game are a perfect representation of what hell could be like, even paradise in the game is a living hell. But yet there is no time to be depressed and there's no time to be sad because everything's always trying to fucking kill you. Putting to words the effect Dark Souls had on my depression and how it helped me cope with it is quite difficult. I couldn't point to you the exact thing that this game did for me because there are multiple things it did. Whether that was the music, the atmosphere, the gameplay, the world building and storytelling, the lore. Much like Phantasy Star 4, it was a huge distraction for me. When many people look at Dark Souls, they look at the outer shell. It's a hard game. It's so unforgiving. You gotta get good. But in the state I was in, when I look at Dark Souls, it tells the story of the many deep flaws within humanity. How humanity itself crumbled. The concepts of paradise and hell. The story of loss for many characters. Of all the games I have ever played in my life, there's no game more emo than Dark Souls. Multitudes of deep stories that somehow all connect together and give you the bigger picture of how this world came to be so depressing and gloomy. Oftentimes you'll hear people tell you that Dark Souls is bigger than you or I, and when they say that, they're not kidding. As 2014 was coming to an end, and 2015 was slowly starting to begin, I was trying to get back up on my feet, looking for all sorts of media to entertain myself. I was going on long bike rides and listening to music. I was starting to get in contact with people once again. I was making new acquaintances and friends, and I built my first PC. One of the reasons I even wanted to build a PC to begin with was for video editing. At that point, I decided I wanted to give my hand at YouTube and see where I could go with it. I had become friends with someone in this time who was a hardcore PC gamer. I'd go over to his place, and he'd show me the many benefits of PC gaming. But he had one game on his desktop screen, one that caught my attention. That little pixelated heart, and what came next was quite possibly one of the deepest and most sincere gaming experiences I've ever had in my entire life as a gamer. It's ridiculous that mentioning Undertale as one of the greatest games you've ever played is considered cliché. Due to such a toxic fanbase at the time, which thank God has died down, now this game can start to age like fine wine because Undertale is simply that good. Even though some seem to think otherwise. But sadly, due to the fact that at the time Undertale was so culturally relevant, many seem to think that it's overrated. Of course, the anti-pop culture part of me wants to agree with these people, but even after 3 playthroughs of the game, I still can't bring myself to see this game as overrated. Undertale has a connection with the player, one that most games simply do not achieve. A relationship between the player and the game is sort of a lost art. Whereas most games are seen as a service these days, Undertale is a piece of art. And for me at the time, it was quite therapeutic. Even with all the millions upon millions of dollars dropped into getting realistic facial animations to express emotion to the player, and all the funds going into famous voice actors, Undertale does what these games cannot, and it does it in the most organic way possible. It makes the player feel. Undertale messes with your emotions better than any game I have ever played. Not counting Secret of the Magic Crystals, of course, that game is perfection. And while at the time I was slowly recuperating from my year-long struggle with depression, and I was in a better mental state than I was for an entire year, that doesn't mean I still wasn't feeling. Shades of depression would often hit, and Undertale was the perfect game at the right time. The struggle to get back on my feet was made easier thanks to this game. Ultimately, we owe it to ourselves to overcome these struggles with depression. It takes a strong will and a high pain tolerance, and like I've said before, it's not something that's going to go away within a week or a few months. Hell, you'll still feel the after effects even a year later. And I don't encourage people to delve solely into video games and to use them as some sort of scapegoat or coping mechanism, because sheltering yourself away from your problems is never the solution. The way I see it is, if your mind is always focused on the things that are making you depressed, you'll never allow your mind to properly rest and be able to properly combat these issues. And that's where games can come in. They can serve as a quick distraction, and sometimes those little distractions can make a huge difference. Sure, you could say that this can be achieved through different forms of entertainment, whether that's music, movies, literature, but that's where I personally feel video games are the best, because they are all of these things and more. Anyways, if you liked the video, drop a like, maybe subscribe, comment, and tell me how big of a faggot I am. I don't know, it's up to you. Maybe I won't share my feelings with you anymore. But till then, it was great seeing all of you and your gorgeous, sexy faces. And Papa Frit will be seeing all of you again very soon.
Fritanga sucks ass.